This is the Christian Circle podcast, and you're listening to Pamela Fernandes, where we have conversations about Christian living. Here's the show. Good evening, and welcome to a new episode of the Christian Circle podcast. Today, we're welcoming Charles back again, who is not talking about saints today, but is actually going to talk about the different forms of Mass in the Catholic Church. So, Charles, welcome back in
Thank you.
COVID world. Yes.
Nice to be back. Yeah. Surviving.
Yes, and for people who've forgotten, tell people who you are.
My name's Charles Johnston, and I am a convert to Catholicism from evangelical Protestantism, and I've been a Catholic officially now for I think 4.5 years, but unofficially it took me over a decade to come into the church. So I've been doing this for a while, studying about the faith, and 2 years ago, I published a book called The Beauty of the Mass about, the whole walkthrough from beginning to end of what we would call the ordinary form of the Catholic Mass.
Okay. So what is this Mass? Because we have touched on this many times before. So tell people who don't really know what is Mass.
Right. So Mass is what a Catholic in the Latin, right, the Latin Church, so Latin Catholic, a Latin Rite Catholic, what they would call our worship, how we worship God. It's a word we use for the liturgy, right, which is the act of worship of God. So in the Western Church, so there's a lot of interchangeable words I'll be using here, the Western Church, Latin Rite of the Church. So what a lot of people think of when they think of Catholicism, because 80% of the world's Catholics are members of the Western Church, right? They think of Mass. When you say that Catholic, when you go to church, how do you worship God? Oh, we go to Mass. It's the word that's commonly used. And the word Mass actually comes from ita missa est. So it was the final words of the Mass, of the liturgy, in Latin, back when the Mass was only said in Latin. And it means it is sent. So ita missa est means it is sent. It was originally meant to mean it is finished. The Mass itself is sent. This prayer is sent to God. You're sent out into the world. But then Pope Benedict XVI said that in the Christian context, the word missa, which is where the word missile comes from, it's to send, fire something to send it out. It took on a whole new context to mean that it's our mission. So, we were supposed to go out in the ordinary form of the Mass, like the English, or whatever the vernacular is, wherever you're at. The priest usually ends with, the Mass is finished, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, or the Mass is finished, glorify the Lord with your life, right? There's different kind of ending formulas, but the Mass itself is finished, but now we go out and live this out into the world. So that's what Mass means. And that's the word that's commonly used to describe the way Catholics worship God.
Okay. And a lot of this Mass is scriptural, right? A lot of our the Great Commission, go and do this in memory of me. Everything is basically scripture. This is not something that they're just practices that were offhand made up by a few bunch of old people.
Yeah, it wasn't a bunch of old white guys in robes in the 1400s got together somewhere in Europe and invented this. There's a lot of different detractors that'll say that's high medieval mysticism mixed together with ancient Roman religion, and try to invent really unsourced too. They just kind of throw all kinds of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Yeah. The Mass itself is very, very, very deeply scriptural. It's very rooted in Scripture. It's very rooted in the way that the Israelites worship God, both from the time of Abraham. If you go all the way back into Genesis, when Abraham defeats the kings and rescues his nephew Lot, I think it's Genesis 25, around there. He rescues his nephew, and then he runs into this guy called Melchizedek, who only appears in this one spot in the Bible. It's only 3 or 4 verses long. Melchizedek is the king of Salem, right, which we later know as Jerusalem. Yes. So he's also known as, Salem means peace, so he's the king of peace, and he's a priest of God, he's a priest of God Most High. So that's another name for the God of Israel, is God Most High. And he offers a sacrifice of bread and wine. Right, so here's this high priest that's kind of a type of Jesus, right? Like looking at it through Christian eyes, we can see that the King of Peace, this high priest, is offering bread and wine. What does that sound like?
Yeah.
Sure sounds like the Mass. And so if you kind of look through the Old Testament, through the lens of Christianity, you can see a lot of things in the Old Testament that point towards the way we worship God in the Mass.
And it does have this entire concept of transubstantiation, which is hard to explain, but for people who want to read, they can go and read and try and make some sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to, if it isn't, as Catholics, like you said, transubstantiation, that's the act of where, the elements that appear to be bread and wine become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ in the hands of the priest on the altar. And if that isn't so, then the Mass is just any other service. It's no different than a prayer meeting. It's no different than whatever. There's no difference between the Mass and any other kind of Christian get-together, right? But because we believe that when Jesus said, "This is my body," we take him at his word. For there's all kinds of reasons why we take him at his word. That could be a whole other episode. But because we believe that, and because Jesus said it, if the Word created the world, right? John says in the first chapter of John, in the prologue of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and through him all things was created. So if the Word of God can go out from his mouth and say, let there be light, and light comes from nothing, right? If we believe that, and we believe that all things essentially, come from God, that God created the world ex nihilo, from nothing. There was nothing before God created it. Then how, why is it so hard? This is the way I convince myself of it. I said, why is it so hard for me to believe that he could say, "This is my body," and it becomes his body? Why do I doubt that if I believe all these other things about God? That he can be put to death and then raised from the dead 3 days later. That's something that doesn't normally happen on a regular day. So we do believe in extraordinary things, and this is an extraordinary miracle that we witness every time we go to Mass. We see a miracle happen. And I mean, kind of off topic a little bit, but it's a very interconnected. The Mass, the Eucharist, the priesthood, it's all, without one you don't have the others.
The other, yeah. So there are various traditions of Mass. So most people would have walked inside a church and realized, oh, there's something going on here, and there's the priest, he's got his back to the altar. You go to another tradition, and then they have a different form of the way they're celebrating. Their service is 3 hours long. So what are the various traditions of Mass?
Right. So like I said before, 80% of the world's Catholics, I'm guessing in that number, I think it's 75, 80%, are what we know as Latin Rite Catholics. A lot of people call them Roman Catholics, right? So I'm a member of the Latin Rite Church. The word Roman Catholic kind of was a pejorative that was invented during the English Reformation to say, like, they're foreigners, basically, to cast aspersions on Catholics during the English Reformation. But a lot of people call it, say Roman Catholics, kind of become a common term. That tradition grew up in Rome, as obviously. And so when St. Peter goes to Rome before he's martyred by Nero, and the church kind of grows up in Rome, the language, the lingua franca, the language of the people in Rome was Latin. And everyone read Latin, everyone spoke Latin. And the service, the Mass that would take place, would usually be done in Latin. So the original, the first Masses were probably done in Aramaic, right? Because you got to consider that it's the apostles are doing what Jesus done, and Jesus spoke Aramaic as his everyday language. So the first original Masses, before the church was scattered from Jerusalem, would have probably been in Aramaic, maybe Greek too, because all the Gospels were written in Greek. So as the church spreads out, the church goes, first they go on to Antioch and Damascus, and then they have spread, St. Paul takes the gospel to, Corinth and Ephesus and Athens, and eventually all the way to Rome. St. Peter and Paul are both martyred in Rome. So in the first, within 50 years of the resurrection, we have the church basically covering the entire Mediterranean coast, like all the Roman Empire. What was the Roman Empire at the time? And it starts to take on local characteristics. Probably not in the first century, probably not in the second century, but by about the third century, you've got the the Western Empire, because at the time, it's kind of getting into a little bit of history. So, but at the time, I think it was Emperor Diocletian. So it's 290 AD. Emperor Diocletian splits the empire in half, makes the Eastern Empire and the Western half of the empire. Each one's ruled by a different guy, but they're all subject to the one emperor in Rome. And the reason he done that was the Eastern Empire was very, very Greek. It was the remnants of Alexander the Great's, Greek Empire that was eventually conquered by the Romans about 100 years before Christ. And it's very Greek in nature, it's Greek in language, it's a very Greek empire. But the Western Empire was very Latin, it had a whole different feel to it, it was very Roman. So he splits it like that, and it ends up that the church kind of takes on these characteristics of where they're at. So the church based in Edessa or in Antioch or in Jerusalem has a more Hellenistic, a more Greek feel to it. And so they speak Greek, they read the scriptures in Greek, and all that. So as time goes on, these kind of, the differences kind of become deeper and more dividing, right? So eventually you start having splits off from the church from theological differences too, like the Council of Chalcedon. There's a split from the church, and there's what's known as the Oriental Orthodox Church splits off, right? So that's like the Coptics and the Armenians, and it's called the Assyrian Church of the East. So they split off because they have a different definition of the nature of Christ. Does he have, one nature? Does he have two natures? Is it two natures that are mixed together? So that's the Chalcedon Council. It was around 435. Caused that that was the first major split in Christianity. And then you go on, and the date that a lot of people give is 1054 for the Great Schism. And that's when the East and the West completely break. It really wasn't a one-time thing. It kind of had happened over the course of about 100 years, a couple hundred years maybe. But eventually the East and the West split, and all the Eastern bishops fall out of communion with Rome. So the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is no longer in communion with the bishops of all these Eastern sees. And so the development of the liturgy and stuff kind of, like I said, it deepens. But a lot of them Eastern liturgies, they all kind of had different things in common. So there was different kind of families, depending on what area each liturgy grew up from, is what, the kind of the flavor that it had, the differences it had. But they're all essentially the same, right? Like they all have the same elements, and then they're all based kind of on the Old Testament worship of Israel, and also the Last Supper and the Road to Emmaus. So you've got them same movements going on in the liturgy, but they all are slightly different.
And it's good to point out that as of a couple of years ago, or I don't know if it was last year, that the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Western churches had a kind of understanding where they were going to try and meet again on various differences, right?
Right. Well, yeah. I also left out there's a church called the Maronite Church. They're in Lebanon, and they're an Eastern Catholic church that has never broke communion with the Pope. They've been in communion with Rome the whole time. But that's 1054. They split apart. In around the 14 or 1500s, some of them start approaching the Pope and saying, like, we'd like to be in communion with Rome again. So that's where we get the Eastern Catholic churches from. So there's the Byzantine Catholic Church, there's the Melkite, Chaldean, the Maronites. So there's all these there's 23 Eastern Catholic churches. And they all came back into communion at different times. There were some all the way up until the 1800s. I think the Chaldeans came back into communion in the late 1800s. But there's all these different groups come back into communion with Rome. And so a lot of Eastern Catholics will call themselves Orthodox in communion with Rome, right? So they're in communion with Rome, they're Catholic, they're just as Catholic as I am. There really is no difference in their Catholicity, but their liturgy is different, and their theology is slightly different too. Like where the West, where we talk about like transubstantiation, and we try to have kind of more of a Thomas Aquinas way of figuring out the way things, they're much more comfortable with saying things are a mystery. They'll say the mystery of this and the mystery of that, and everything's a mystery. And not a mystery as in like it's completely unknowable, but just we're not going to try to figure out the mind of God. We're just perfectly happy with thinking that, how does bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ? Well, it's a mystery in a good way. they're much more comfortable with mystery, where in the West we're more analytical,
Yeah.
and we want to know how exactly. And as much as I go to they call it divine liturgy, what we would call the Mass. As much as I love divine liturgy, and I go probably once every couple of months to a divine liturgy, I like the analytical way of figuring out the way things work. It's just so I feel kind of split between the two.
Now, we focus that they are unique in the way that their theology works, and the way they have their tradition. So what are the biggest similarities between all of these, despite the fact that they are different? At the heart of it all, what is the similarity between all of these traditions? Why is it still the one Mass?
Right. Well, the biggest similarity is they have, so even the Eastern Orthodox that are not in communion with us, not Eastern Catholic, they have valid holy orders because their bishops are validly ordained bishops. So they have valid holy orders.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they say the anaphora, right, which we would call the Eucharistic prayer, when they say that prayer and they call down the Spirit upon the gifts that are on the altar, it really does become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, just the same as it does in St. Peter's Basilica, or St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York.
Yeah.
You go there, you go to, whatever the local Byzantine Catholic church down the street or an Eastern Orthodox church, and it's all validly confected Eucharist. So that's the main similarity that we have with both the Eastern Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox is they have valid holy orders, they have valid priests, and so, by extension, they have a valid Eucharist. And the Mass, or the Divine Liturgy, depending on where you're at, is the one same sacrifice of Christ on Calvary. So we're present, and they make that really clear too. Like when you're in a Divine Liturgy, I don't mean to talk down my Latin church, but some Latin churches that really, you go to your average parish church, they really stripped away the beauty, and they've stripped away a lot of the symbolism and stuff. And especially churches that were, renovated in the 1960s and 70s, they took down any kind of religious art, they repainted the walls, they changed the altar. So now you go into a church and it looks like a gymnasium with a square table up in the front, right? Yeah. It doesn't change. It's still a valid Mass and still a valid Eucharist, but by losing that beauty, it's one of the transcendence of the church, truth, beauty, and goodness. By losing the beauty, you lose a lot of the symbolism, and by losing symbolism, you can forget where you're at.
Yeah.
You go into an Eastern church, so go into, and I encourage everyone, everyone I talk to, even not just people listening to this podcast, my friends, I tell them, like, listen, you need to go to a Byzantine church and see how they do things. It's amazing. Yeah. It really is. And it reminds me of if you go to like a traditional Latin Mass, it's the same kind of thing, like the incense and the smells and the bells, as they say. But if you go to a Byzantine church, there's certain symbols and symbolism that makes it absolutely crystal clear what's happening here. The priest is the only, there's doors in the middle of the church. There's a thing called iconostasis, so it's like a screen that separates the area around the altar from the area where the people are, right?
Yeah.
So that is it's like the altar rail in a lot of older, Roman Catholic churches, right? It's more pronounced because it goes floor to ceiling rather than just a few feet high, 2 feet high. But it's a boundary, right? Because the body of the church, the nave or the seating area, it represents earth, right? And then that's heaven.
Yeah.
So there's this barrier between heaven and earth. And even though the veil tore when Jesus died on the cross, the veil in the temple tore, the curtain tore, that tore the separation between God and man, yes. But there's still this separation between this life and the life after. But when the doors open, when the liturgy begins, then doors open in the middle, the royal doors, they call them, and the priest comes out. And it represents now that boundary between heaven and earth is blurred. That boundary's open. And we're entering in, because, during Mass, when the holy, 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 right before, during the consecration, we're joining, the priest says, in the Latin rite, the priest says, let us join all the angels and saints who forever sing your hymn of unending glory. And then we sing the holy, holy. That comes from Isaiah, and it also comes from Revelation. And both Isaiah and John the Revelator, St. John, saw in heaven all the angels around the throne of God singing that hymn, that thrice holy hymn of praise. So we're joining in on that. Like that isn't just, that isn't just something the priest says. We're literally in heaven at all times, eternally. Everyone in heaven is praising God, right? Saying holy, holy, and that's an Eastern tradition that saying holy 3 times really magnifies how holy God is. It's beyond comprehension how holy God is. So we're entering into that prayer. Well, when you go to a divine liturgy in a Byzantine church, when they open them doors, you realize, like, hold on a second here. This is heaven and earth. The boundary between heaven and earth is open, and now we're joining in on the heavenly worship that goes on permanently in heaven, where Jesus is offering himself to the Father on our behalf as both the priest and victim. And so it really is like, that's just one of the things. And like I said, I'd encourage anyone to go to a Byzantine church.
They usually also have this it's kind of similar to Old Testament worship, where you're actually entering the Holy of Holies, and there's that demarcation is very clear that yes, that you are entering the Holy of Holies. This altar is really something that is precious, and you feel a very distinct level of holiness or amazement when you're actually at an Eastern church.
Right, and that's what I think we've lost so much in the West. And we've lost that beauty and that awe, and the reverence. And it, not everywhere. It's not every church. But, and I go around the country a lot, and I see some beautifully done churches, even newly built churches that are beautiful and are very reverent and very traditionally designed. The way they have altar rails around them and stuff. But I've been to some churches that you don't know if am I at a mass, or is this just, a gathering of the local AA? You don't know what it is, because it isn't really, there's nothing, the priest gets up and the priest doesn't even have really vestments on. He's just kind of, there's, good and bad. But when you go to the Byzantine church, they really have kind of that old, it feels like you've stepped back in time, in the best possible way. You've gone back in time to the Old Testament, like you said, like to the temple in Jerusalem. And this is the holy place. This is where you can go as not a ordained minister, and this is where only an ordained minister, a priest, or a deacon can go beyond this line.
Okay. So, other than that, now there are a lot of other churches. Okay, there's Lutherans, there's Protestants, there's Pentecostals, and they also have what they call a service, basically. And nowadays you see a lot of them have very similar things to what Catholics do, in the sense that they will have bread, they will have wine, they will break toast or whatever, and they call the same thing now a service. So how is this different from what all these other denominations are doing?
Right. Well, I mean, like I said at the beginning, it all comes back to the Eucharist. If the Eucharist isn't what the church says it is, if you look at the Eucharist in the hands of the priest, and that really just is bread and wine, it's not the body and blood of Christ, well, then we're missing out big time, because they've got rock concerts with fog machines and smoke and strobe lights and stuff.
Yes.
And we've got an old marble, gymnasium with wooden pews that aren't very comfortable. So, I mean, if the Eucharist isn't real, then all this is for nothing, But the Eucharist is what sets it apart. The Eucharist is what sets apart the Catholic Church and both Eastern and Western Catholic churches, and the Eastern Orthodox too. The Eucharist is what sets everything apart, because if that's not what the church says is, then all this, it doesn't matter. We can go to any denomination, like you said. We can go to any church service. We can go to one of them mega churches and hear a really good motivational talk and a really good rock band beforehand. But if the Eucharist is what we say it is, which I believe with my whole heart that it is, then that's the difference. That's Jesus present there, and Jesus is giving himself to us, for this journey that we're on towards heaven. We're on this pilgrimage towards heaven, and we need food for the journey, and he's giving himself as the food for the journey.
So what would you say to somebody who says, well, my church, whatever denomination it may be, is also celebrating the Eucharist? I mean, there are people who are gonna write back definitely and say that, well, we are having the Eucharist because that's what we call it. So what will you say to them?
Well, there are some. Well, most Protestants or most non-Catholic churches, most Protestant churches, have some form of like commemoration of the Last Supper, or they'll call it, communion. They have different words for it. Hardly any of them call it the Eucharist, except like the Anglicans will call it the Eucharist.
Mm.
But they'll call it, the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, communion, breaking bread. There's a bunch of different words they have for it. But if you ask them, well, what is that you're partaking in?
Mm.
They'll say, like, well, it's a representation of Jesus' sacrament. Okay. But it's not actually Jesus you're consuming, right? And if they say yes, and you say, well, then why aren't you Catholic?
Mm.
If you believe that, then you need to come over, swim across the Tiber and come join us. But if, a lot of them will say, I was Protestant for over 30 years of my life. And I would have said, well, no, it's, we partake. What I would have said, if someone asked me, like, what do you believe when you take communion? I'd say, well, it's Jesus, it's a representation. It's us to remember Jesus' death on the cross, or it's a commemoration of the Lord's Supper, because he said, do this in memory of me, so that's why we're doing it. But if you notice, 90% of Protestant churches, of non-Catholic churches, partake in communion like quarterly or monthly, right? Some churches is only yearly. They do it once a year. So they don't really put much weight in it. They only do it because Jesus actually literally says, do this in memory of me. So they're like, well, I guess we're supposed to do it. But they don't really have a schedule on when to do it. If it's so important, you'd think you'd do it more often.
Yeah.
I've rarely seen a Protestant church that has weekly communion. I have seen it, but it's not very common. It's usually monthly at the most. And they'll all have different reasons for why they're doing it, but none of them will say that this is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, because it's not, unless it's in the hands of a priest. Because when Jesus commissioned the disciples at the Last Supper, the apostles of the Last Supper, he commissioned them, and he said, this is my blood that's poured out for you. The word that he used for poured out was a cultic sacrificial word. Only the priests in the Old Covenant had the ability to pour out the sacrifices upon the altar, the libation sacrifice. You couldn't do that if you weren't a priest. So by him telling them, do this in memory of me, he was commissioning them as the priests of the new covenant. And that's, you can't be a non-priest. So a lot of Protestants, they won't believe in the ministerial priesthood. They'll say there's a priesthood of all believers, right?
Yeah.
So yes, we agree. The Catholic Church agrees with that. Yes, all people that are baptized, men, women, children, everyone that's baptized is baptized into the priestly office of Jesus, the prophetic office of Jesus, and the king, the monarchical office of Jesus. The priest, prophet, and king. We're all baptized into that. But there's a difference between the ministerial priesthood and the priesthood, the common priesthood. And there even was a difference back in the Old Covenant. Before they worshipped the golden calf at the foot of Mount Sinai, all Israelites were able to offer sacrifice to God. But after that break with God, because of their idolatry, it becomes now just the Levites are the only ones that offer the sacrifices. And then only the sons of Aaron are the priests that are the actual priests of the Old Covenant. And the Levites are kind of like they're the high priests, the Aaronic priesthood, and the Levites are kind of the common priests. So they got that took away from them because of their sin. And it was like Abraham, when Abraham had the child with Hagar, because of that, he had now circumcision comes into the picture. So there's because of these different breaks of the covenants all through the Old Testament, there's different strictures put in on the covenant. That happened in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, too, there was levels of the priesthood in the Old Testament, and there continues to be levels of priesthood in the New Testament. So if you're not an ordained priest, you can call the bread and wine that you have at your church service whatever you want to call it, but it isn't the body of Christ. And I don't mean to be confrontational about it, but it's just not. So, especially for churches that don't believe it, they really. But there are some churches that believe they're confecting the Eucharist, but they're not validly ordained priests, and so they can't. Like, I can't just go out into my house and say, you know what, today I've decided that I'm a priest, and then celebrate a mass in my living room and make a piece of bread and a glass of wine, the Eucharist. I can't do that. I don't have that ability.
So speaking of confrontation, what about now? I know, especially in social media, you see a lot, and this is like Catholic Twitter, Catholic whatever has become such a battlefield. Yeah, with people saying, "Oh, TLM is so much better. You guys should come over to us. We should go over to you," and all of this stuff. At the heart of it, it is still the one Jesus, the one same true Jesus who never seems to change, and we seem to be changing all of these things. So, what to say to people who are so divisive about over these traditions of Mass?
Right. See, it's good. I think it's good to speak your mind, and I think it's good to stick up for what you believe in and stuff. But that word that you said, divisive, that is the key. That's one of the fruits of the devil, is sowing discord among the brethren. It says that right in the New Testament, that that's what the devil does. He sows discord. I mean, even the word itself, devil, diabolos, is divider. The devil divides, and I think it's one of the greatest crimes against Christianity has been the divisions. Jesus in John chapter 17 prayed, Lord, God Father, let them be one as you and I are one, so that the world will know I sent them. Right? He prayed that, and he prayed that twice. He prayed that 2 separate times in John chapter 17. And then Pope John Paul II wrote an encyclical, Ut Unum Sint, that they may be one. Right? And that's where he called the Eastern and Western churches the two lungs of the church that had to breathe with. The first major, there was the Chalcedon schism, and there was this schism, and that schism. The Great Schism of 1054 was the first major rupture in the unity of the church. That's where you said, the Eastern and the Western church. And then you had the Protestant Revolution in 1517, and that was another rupture in Western Europe. And the Eastern Orthodox will say, well, you guys in the Western church, you ruptured in 1517, and then Luther and Calvin ruptured from each other, and then Zwingli come along, and now there's thousands of them. Well, the Eastern Orthodox have also had multiple, each one of the bishops are an authority unto themselves, and none of them have any say over the other ones. They've all, there's the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Each nation has its own Orthodox Church, and none of them they're in communion, but it's like a loose communion, So they've fared just as poorly as we have as far as unity goes. And I really, it grieves me, coming from a Protestant background. Now I converted to Catholicism. I don't hate Protestants at all, and I don't hate Eastern Orthodox. I think we all need to be one. I really do. I pray for the unity of the church all the time, because disunity is not of God. This division and divisiveness isn't of God. Jesus prayed, he literally, right before he's just about to be put to death, he knows what's coming, and what does he do? He prays that we may be one. That was his prayer in John 17. So, as far as divisiveness goes, I love a Latin Mass. I went to a few in the past few months. A couple I went to on accident, who I didn't even know was Latin Mass. I walked in, and the priest is back, facing the altar, and I noticed the vestments were different, and then I heard him chanting in Latin. I was like, oh man, I lucked out here. I just happened to walk into this church at the right time, at the right place, and here I am. But my parish, my home parish, is a ordinary form, so it's, the regular in English Mass. It's very reverent. I think Father Robert and Father Talo and Father Edward do a beautiful job. But I go to that parish, and that's my home parish. But I do love going to a Latin Mass. I also love going to Eastern churches. I want to try to visit, all the different types of Eastern Catholic churches. And, Roman Catholics, so if you're a Latin Rite Catholic, you can go to an Eastern church, an Eastern Catholic church, and you can receive the Eucharist, because we're all Catholic, And it's funny, too, because when you go to them, kind of off topic, but they pray for the Pope in their liturgy, in the Divine Liturgy, like 10 or 15 times you'll hear. And for Pope Francis, our Holy Father, Pope Francis, the Bishop of Rome, and they pray for him like all through the liturgy, way more than we do. We're Latin, we're Roman Catholics, and we pray for the Pope once during the Eucharistic prayer. They do it like 10 times. But yeah, I think the disunity and everyone at each other's throats, and like, I like the ordinary form, and I like the extraordinary form, and people willing to kill each other over this, not literally, but still, like, on the internet, I think part of it has to do with social media. Everyone's so tough when they're behind a keyboard, and you don't have to say something to someone's face, and it's all anonymous. If you yell at someone from Australia that likes Latin Mass better than the ordinary form of the Mass, you're never going to see that person at the water cooler, at your work, or sit in the restaurant next to them at the table. So people's much more coarse to each other online than they are in person. But a lot of that online coarseness is bleeding into normal everyday life. I think it's really where we're spiraling down as far as decency goes and civility towards each other. And I just, like I said, I think divisiveness is of the devil, 100%. But also, I wouldn't roll over and say, like, well, I'm just going to agree to everything you say just because I don't want to be divisive. No, there's a line there. I don't want to cross that line. I try to be cordial and civil with everyone I talk to. I believe certain things. They might believe certain things. I'll try to convince them of my point of view, but without fighting with them, because you can have an argument without having a fight. People's lost the ability to have an argument, to put forth evidence for their position, and make a case without, becoming ad hominem attacks or, building up straw men just to attack them. So I think we could take a lesson from Thomas Aquinas and just put forward a good case and a good defense. But like St. Peter said, but always be prepared to give a defense for the hope that's in you, but do it with love.
Yeah. And any kingdom that is divided against itself would not stand, right? And so whatever we're doing on social media is kind of an example is a reflection of the church in general. If we are fighting right on social media, you can imagine people must be wondering, I wonder what's going on within the church if it is like this on the outside.
Right. Yeah, this is what they're doing in public. What are they doing in private? Imagine if you were considering, I'm thinking about maybe I want to convert to Catholicism, and you decide to check out hashtag Catholic Twitter. That might turn you off.
Yeah.
I tried to stay off of Catholic Twitter myself.
Me too, yeah.
Just because it can be so divisive. And the thing is that I agree with there's a lot of people on Catholic Twitter that I completely 100% disagree with their style. I don't like the divisiveness. But I agree with the substance of what they're saying. I just wish they were a little more, refined in the way they say it, because like I said, I do love the Latin Mass, and I love tradition. I'm very traditional, but at the same time, I don't think calling people who go to a ordinary form of the Mass heretics
is helping.
Not only is that not accurate, I don't think that's accurate at all, but it's not helpful either.
Yeah.
Like, it's wrong, and it's wrong-headed. The church, I'm not the Pope, and neither is anyone on Twitter except for Pope Francis, but I'm not the Pope, and so I don't get to decide who is and isn't in the church, who is and isn't a heretic. That's a word that gets thrown around a lot, heretic, too. And, I think my opinion is, if the church says we can have Mass in what we call the ordinary form. So like when you go to a regular Sunday Mass, your local parish church, that's the ordinary form of the Mass. That's okay, right? Yeah. You can say, I don't like that, I like the Latin Mass better. That's a fine opinion. But the church has said this is a valid form of the Mass. It's a valid liturgy to worship Jesus Christ, to worship the Father, and to worship the Holy Spirit, to receive the Eucharist, and to fulfill your Sunday obligation. This is valid. Okay. I am not. I'm not even a priest. I'm just a layman. But I have no authority to say, no, you know what, church? You're wrong. I'm right, you're wrong. Because what does that make me any different than Martin Luther, right? I mean, we're Catholics. If we say that we're an authority unto ourselves and we're not bound to the magisterium of the church, then we're putting ourselves outside of communion with the church. Yeah. And I don't want to be outside of communion with the church. I didn't become Catholic to then turn around and say, you know what, I'm right and everyone else is wrong. Yeah. My father used to tell me, if you think you're the only one right and everyone around you is wrong, you might want to rethink your position.
Wise words. So today, the thing is, with spiritual communion happening, with a lot of lockdown happening, there are many people who are not even Christian who are now participating in the Eucharist. And there's this whole new talk about how they can be Catholic without really becoming Catholic. So how can everybody participate in the Eucharist, even though, and I see this all the time, people who come late to Mass, people who have had breakfast like just before stepping into the door. You can celebrate the Eucharist without like taking in the bread and wine. So how can everyone participate in the Eucharist at the same time following the discipline of the Mass?
Right. Well, yeah, see, because we have, as Latin Rite Catholics, we have an obligation to attend Mass on every Sunday and every Holy Day of obligation, right? We don't have an obligation to receive the Eucharist, though, on those same days. Okay. So the point is, you're supposed to be there, be present, be physically, spiritually present right, and worship God and pray along with the priest. But you're not under any obligation to receive the Eucharist, except for once a year, and it should be during the Easter season, which a lot of people probably missed out on this year because Easter is like when all this really kicked off, the lockdowns and stuff. It seems like the devil really timed it, right? Yeah, so you're only under obligation to receive the Eucharist once a year. I wouldn't recommend that as, a Catholic who I derive a lot of strength from receiving the Eucharist.
Yes.
And it was painful, like physically and spiritually painful to watch Mass on TV. And they gave us the prayers to pray the spiritual communion when it come time to communion. And I would watch my parish start a live stream in the Mass. I think it was like a week or 2 weeks after the lockdowns began. And they would read this prayer of spiritual communion, Jesus, even though I can't receive you physically now, I receive you spiritually and come into my heart and be with me always. And that helped, but it wasn't really the same. I didn't feel completely the same. And it was because I've only been to Mass probably since I've been Catholic, maybe 2 or 3 times where I wasn't in a state of grace or whatever extenuating circumstance where I couldn't receive the Eucharist. And it hurt me. Like I actually felt this physical longing, like I can't believe what's going on here. I overslept and I couldn't, get to confession in time. Whatever the reason was, I didn't like it. And I endeavored to, I'm never going to do that again. And I went, that was like 2 years ago. It happened to me the first time. And because I missed the posted confession times, I couldn't find confession anywhere around. And so I went to Mass without going to confession. And it had been like a month since I went to confession. And I couldn't receive the Eucharist.
You feel it,
And then the lockdowns happened and I couldn't receive the Eucharist for probably a month or 2 months. And I didn't like it one bit. But there is, we're under obligation to attend Mass. We're not under obligation to receive the Eucharist. So we're all called. We have to, depends on where you're at, because the bishops have been given dispensations because a lot of people can't go to Mass right now. They're just, it's not happening depending on where you're at in the world. So but everyone can participate. Even non-Catholics can go to Mass and pray along. There's nothing to stop them from doing that. You can't receive the Eucharist if you're not Catholic. But there's nothing to stop you from being there physically present. You would still receive graces, certain graces, not all the graces available, because the Eucharist is the pinnacle of all grace, right? But you still do receive grace just by being there and being at the Mass, being present.
So thank you so much for talking to us about the various traditions of the Catholic Mass, and tell people where they can find you online and about your book.
My book is called The Beauty of the Mass, and it is available on Amazon. And you can find me online. I'm very active on Facebook mostly. Like I said, Catholic Twitter has kind of left a bad taste in my mouth a lot of times. But I'm on Facebook as Now That I'm Catholic. I think it's facebook.com/CatholicConvert2016, or you can just put in the search bar Now That I'm Catholic. And I'm always posting stuff on Facebook, and my website is nowthatimcatholic.com.
Okay, great. So thank you for talking to us after a very long time, Charles, and hope to have you back again.
I hope to be back. Yes, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.